Dalila will first of all give a short presentation on her book, and then we'll invite some responses from Danielle and from Debra. That might lead into some questions. We've sort of been discussing certain aspects of the book behind the scenes, thinking of the sorts of questions and we might raise and the sorts of topics we might pursue. But we'd also like to open up the discussion to people who are present here today and also to people who have joined us online. For those of you who've joined us online, we can't actually hear you, so if you do have questions to ask, you'll have to put those in the chat. So it would be great if you could do that. So we're slightly constrained by the technology here to reach the online listeners and viewers. We have to speak into the microphone, although a microphone isn't actually necessary for you in the room. We only have the one microphone, so we'll have to pass the microphone around to the various speakers. Fingers crossed things will run smoothly. So I'll hand over to Dalila, who will get things started.
Okay, thank you so much, Richard, for the introductions, and thank you also to Danielle and Debra for agreeing to come here today and contribute and give their responses to my book, which I'm just going to introduce very briefly. I will try not to take more than 10 minutes just to give you an idea of how the project came about, what the book is about, and why, maybe, and also more or less just an overview of what the contents are. But then I would like just to open more to the discussion since we have this great opportunity to have Debra and Danielle here, and also hear your thoughts and see how it goes. So what the book is about. So the title is quite a bit self-explanatory. It's a title that was imposed, let's say, by the publisher in terms that, but I'm glad that it's also so frankly kind of gives you an idea of what it's really about. So basically, this is a study that is an archive-based historical reconstruction of the role of women in Italian cinema in a key period that I actually identified going a little bit against what is conventionally thought to be the periodization of the history of Italian cinema. Working, yes, on post-World War II Italian cinema, but from 1958 to 1981. This period is conventionally linked to what was considered the peak of popularity of Italian cinema internationally. So we think about some of the key directors like Antonioni, Fellini, and so on and so forth. We can associate them with the 60s, and obviously then this period was then followed in the 70s by a sort of like decline of the popularity and reach of Italian cinema. So this is what generally histories of Italian cinema tell you about. So period, yeah, of big authors, big international reach, and popularity also in terms of cinema goers going a lot to the movies, and also engaged with film and popular culture massively. So cinema was at the center of the media system at the time. But also it's a period that corresponds with the modernization of the country, so to speak. So when basically mass consumerism kind of came about in Italian society, hence the role of entertainment. But usually in this historiographies, the role of women, it's kind of like just not that much evident of what they did in relation to cinema and mass culture more broadly. So did they went to the movies? Yes, of course, but how and why? It's not very clear yet. And did they make movies at the time? Not that much. We know that. There are very few female directors in this period. But despite this, this is a period in which actually the role of women in Italian society became increasingly visible. And also a period of massive politicization of women. So the start of the feminist movement as a mass movement in the 1970s. So how we can connect this sociocultural visibility of women as politicized collectivity, but also as consumers in this framework of Italian cinema that is, big authors and international praise, art, cinema, but then what else we can say? So my book tried to respond to these questions, also trying to kind of work with archives, which have been always kind of a tricky subject for feminist historians, because usually when we look at archives, we find a lot of gaps in which it's hard to find the presence of women or women at the center of archival collections, especially when they are institutional. But also wanted to challenge this idea again of invisibility, absence in the archives, and so in the historical sources, as well as in the historiography of cinema. And by doing so, I just wanted also to challenge some of the main staples of what is historiography, is cinematic historiography, so the history of cinema, so a tendency of privilege and authorial frameworks, so work on and reconstruct the work of singular individual filmmakers, or just focusing on representation, so how women or femininity are represented in films, and this idea of exceptionality of women filmmakers. So yes, there are maybe a couple of filmmakers in this period, and let's focus on those, and then we have solved this issue that, yes, there are women, there are some women, but I don't want to accept this idea of exceptionality. I think that focusing solely on representation, it's not enough, especially looking at in terms of historiography, because we need to do a more organic work in order to reconstruct the actual role and meaning of gender in history. So I took this approach of looking at the everyday, as Raymond Williams teaches us, as cultural as everyday. So look at the practices and everyday practices of relating with cinema that women historically engaged in this very lively and interesting period of increasing visibility in society. And this focus on practices also responds to political urgency, because my approach to scholarship is politically informed as well, of looking and making a collective historiography and not singling out individuals and exceptional individuals, but actually, again, looking more organically at series of practices and how they are intertwined together in order to find more actors and kind of like to find out a plurality of voices, a multiplicity, instead of, again, canonizing and reproducing canons that have always historically excluded women and what they did in film. But this is not because I am this great feminist theorist, or for me, it was mostly focusing on the sources and let the sources talk. So what is mine is also an empirical approach, in the sense that I go to the archive, that it's a type of archive of empirical research. And it's through this empiric theorizing, and I borrow here from Iris Marion Young, that I kind of came with this framework in order to put together all these various subjectivities, links, and practices together. And of course, doing this meant adopting a bottom-up perspective, and also tackle and engage with some challenges. One is that of empiricism. I talked about empirical theorizing, but this is not easy, especially when you work with sources. archival sources, not to have like a flat engagement with these materials, but actually trying to understand how to go beyond that. It's not always easy to link micro histories and very particular histories with a theory or with something that tell us more about it. And then there was the issue of fragmentation, again, linked with this idea of doing this granular work. So how to keep together microhistories. And then the problem of anachronism. So where I position myself in this history that some way relates to me effectively, but also is distant from me from a lot of reasons, and try to figure out how this effective engagement can actually help me to do a better historiography and not kind of, again, have a flat engagement with sources. So, and then, of course, what does it mean? And this is linked to empiricism, confronting with archives that are fragmented, always in which films are not available anymore. Maybe I just come across a title, but then I will never get to actually see the film or find any more information about it. And what to do with when evidence seems missing, and what is the role of, again, affect and imagination when we deal with these historiographies. This is more or less what the book is about, and what I try, the thread that keeps together the different chapters. The book is structured in 3 parts, one focusing on audiences, reception, spectatorship and reception, another one more on representation, and then the last one on production. I followed a sort of like this pyramid in which obviously their audiences are the bigger chunk of people in terms that they engage with film culture, then representation, because obviously there is a variety of representations, and then film industry as a more like narrow group that I was kind of investigating. So there's, in the slide, there's the breakdown of the chapters. So I'm not going to going through all of them. But each section follows a chronological order and focus on case studies that kind of, I hoped, encompass the variety of different debates, practices that were emerging from the sources. So I think I spoke probably too much. So I will leave now the floor to our discussants. I don't know if the chair wants to re-jump in.
Sure, I'll invite Danielle Hipkins from the University of Exeter to respond first of all.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much, Richard, and thanks, Dalila, for reminding us of the scope and ambition of this project. I'm just so delighted to be here today to celebrate it with you. I think it's really a seminal work for Italian film studies, so many congratulations. And I just think you've managed to weave an incredibly delicate web of restoration, really, in Italian film history, and it sort of, for me, overlays a history that I thought I knew, and gives me a completely different perspective on it. So thank you very much. I think one of the things that strikes me most, I think, is in your final words, you propose a new research culture of collegiality and collaboration. And I think that your book is really exemplary in offering this, because I think what you've done here, even if you've researched it individually, you've opened a lot of doors for future scholars. And I'd just like to thank you for that, because I think there were doors that needed to be opened probably quite a long time ago. And I know that certainly I'll be using this as a handbook for my undergraduate and postgraduate students in the future. So thank you for that. Just to say a little bit more about it, I mean, I think that the tensions that you managed to hold in play in this work are particularly impressive. You mentioned yourself between the collective and the individual, the mainstream and the experimental, effective, material, activist, everyday, national, transnational, spectator, filmmaker, and finally the distance and the detail. And as I say, I think I'm particularly impressed by the way that you managed to combine the scope of the project, as people can see from this great range of case studies, and depth. Each of those chapters brings a new meaning to our understanding of that particular topic. I'd just like to give a few examples to share with people here, and I hope that if you haven't read the book already, these will encourage you to engage with it. When you look at spectatorship in this way, Dalila, of bringing together sort of everyday spectators and feminist spectators, these are things that are usually treated completely separately, and I think it's really refreshing to think about bringing those two fields alongside one another. And there's this lovely example of an individual that you find, Giovanna Pala, who started out on the usual kind of trajectory that we understand women to occupy in Italian cinema, which is that she's a beauty queen and then she gets selected to perform in post-war cinema. But it becomes impossible for her to continue that career due to her lesbianism. And as a result of that, she becomes a feminist activist. So I thought that was just such a lovely example of the ways in which these two more traditional reading of Italian cinema and a feminist reading might actually go hand in hand. And it would be great to hear from you whether there might be more potential for those kind of stories in this history, and whether you found any. I also appreciated what you call a deliberately anachronistic reading of comedies of the 1960s. Dalila looks particularly at the repeated figure of the frigid housewife, or the housewife who decides that she's not going to have sex anymore, and reads this as a kind of strategic celibacy, thereby claiming these figures for the feminist archive. And I think I really appreciated that reading of this period. And again, it offers an encouragement. I agree with you that we shouldn't focus only on representation of women, but I think it encourages us to go back to cinema and reread some of those films. And I liked your point about sexuality being a focal point for social commentary in Italy, particularly in relation to the mainstream media. And if we get the chance, I'd love to hear more from you on that and whether you think there are other examples. I love your attention to the flows of mass media production, and it certainly shed new light for me on the discourses around pornography, to think about how that entered into diverse strata of Italian culture, and so became something that feminists tended to oppose less per se than as part of a broader objectification and symptom of patriarchal sexualization of women. So I thought that was another interesting insight that you offer, but also thinking about intersecting discourses so attentively all the time, Dalila. This analysis of that intersection between mass-marketed pornography and colonial discourses of the Black Venus that you identify in your chapter on Ines Pellegrini, and how she moved between Italian Playboy, auteur cinema, and softcore porn, was a really a subtle and nuanced reading, I think, of the position in which female performers can find themselves caught. And finally, I mentioned the distance and the detail, and in your final section, I love the way that you chose to map the histories of women attending Italy's major film school and find out what had happened to them, and put that alongside the individual trajectory of Mara Blasetti, who was the daughter of a famous film director. And again, I think mapping those histories that might, I think in more traditional, as you say, canonical readings of Italian cinema, might be things that we regard as histories of failure, bring a new methodology to our understanding of the archive and how to understand the trajectories of women in history. And again, it would be great to hear more from you on that. Sorry, I probably need to stop now. Just a couple of questions that I want to touch upon that have come up really in relation to things I've noticed in Italian culture recently. As you know, I'm interested in distinctions made or not made between girls and women. And it was great to see some examples in your book that were attentive to those differences. You mentioned the magazine Così and then Ragazza In. I wonder whether I'd love to hear your thoughts on that particular distinction within the feminist movement between girls and women, and whether you feel that that takes shape, particularly after the era of student protest, or whether feminism in Italy remains largely focused on the figure of women. And a final question, and I have many more, but I'll just kind of put it out there, is that I know that recently, in thinking about the archive and its absences, which you do so well, there's been quite a lot of discussion of the absence of consideration of the Italian South and its islands. And I wondered kind of what role that had played in your research for this particular project. But yeah, just to reiterate, congratulations, Dalila, and thank you for such a wonderful contribution to Italian film history.
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting questions there, and I want to talk about these questions as well, so I won't take up too much time. Thank you both, and it's a delight to be here in Leica celebrating Dalila's book. I seem to be doing a lot of these book responses at the moment as I sort of ease back into research things, and it's a really lovely thing to do actually, because it forces you to actually take time to read, which we so seldom get to do as academics anymore. And to read something that you think, you know, it's a shame, but it's true. And to read something that you think, okay, this is a slightly different topic for me. I'm not going to think about how I immediately put this to use in my own book. I'm not going to think about using this work. And then inevitably, when that happens, you find you sit down with the work and it completely clicks everything you do into new focus. And you immediately want to cite it and teach it and all of that. And it's very much the case with this work. So that's been really great. And I feel as though I learned so much, Dalila, from your kind of patient, forensic, empirically sophisticated, theoretically rich work on Italian cinema. But also, there's so much that will resonate more broadly, because what you are doing is proposing a way of thinking about research and about what we're doing with feminist research as a project, as it were, that will resonate with anybody studying gender, feminist theory, decolonial scholarship, sexuality, mediation, audiences, archives, you know, ideas around care, all things that we think about a lot in sociology and that resonate across disciplines in really exciting, important ways, I think. So the book transports us to a specific time and place, but it also invites us to think about how those histories and those memories resonate in different spaces in contemporary culture. There's a lot of this kind of work in feminist media research anyway, and we'll talk about that. But yeah, so much that will resonate with many of us here today, I'm sure. One of the things I was interested in, Dalila, is the way you tell the story of your project, because you talk about it as a kind of shadow project undertaken when you're officially working on something else. And maybe we can talk about that. Yeah, I see recognition. But it's fitting to think about, I started thinking about feminist research as what we do in the shadows, which is a whole different project, but never mind. And this is often precisely the work, isn't it, of both doing feminist scholarship and living a feminist life. It's about identifying the kind of labor, relations, ideas, movements, cultural production, creativity that happen in what are seen as the shadows. You know, we talk a lot about secrecy and silence, or visibility and invisibility in feminist scholarship, all those weird kind of structuring binaries. And we have to ask, you know, on what terms do we see those things as shadowy? You know, what kind of is pulling focus, casting those shadows? And the book is full of these discussions about the way that we direct our attention as film spectators, as scholars, as, you know, whoever, people thinking about this. And there are these kind of figures that take up space. I like the way that you refuse to do work on women filmmakers and women as consumers of film on the terms set by this sort of heteropatriarchal white supremacist model. So away from the figure of the male genius, who's constantly reproduced in film histories and narratives, away from these kind of quite anecdotal ways of talking about history that reproduce the same kind of masculinist networks and the same kinds of anecdotes and stories in which women and people of color, minorities, are often kind of collateral. They're kind of objectified in a different level than that level of representation that you also talk about so beautifully. You talk about sort of Me Too and the reassuring stories that patriarchy tells itself about the casting couch. Oh, everyone knew what they were doing and this was completely consensual, and that gets reproduced over and over again. And it's only when we speak to people who are raised and silenced within those narratives that we get to this kind of different, granular history. I want to say more authentic because that's a vexed term in itself, but a different kind of history. And when you start to look at that, I mean, I almost picture you kind of like an archaeologist engaged in this sort of digging away. And what you say is that when you start to look for women in film cultures, actually women are everywhere. So it's taken for granted that women are absent, and that narrative of absence, marginality, silence starts to become real and material. It starts to reproduce itself. And actually, women are everywhere. They are doing rich work as consumers of film, as creatives, as people involved in filmmaking, as the object of representation, and as producers. And you do this work of investigating the everydayness and the ordinariness of culture. It's a really central project for cultural studies and for feminist theory. And the book tells the story, these alternative stories. I think about the petit récit in sort of post-structuralist terms, of women's everyday participation in film cultures. And this is important because, as you cite, the Marxist feminist thinker Silvia Federici, it's very important to my own work and the work of lots of colleagues at Lancaster. She notes that the marginalization of women's cultural production and cultural labor has been material in excluding women from the places where decisions are taken and has deprived us of the agency to define our own experience. Excluded from the centre, or was seen as the centre of filmmaking, criticism, and also scholarship, women and minorities have had to be resourceful, had to be really creative in finding alternative spaces to engage in all those forms of work. And if we want to resist the totalizing, sort of universalizing logics produced by patriarchy, we need these kind of lively and adaptable research methods, these really detailed research methods to do justice to this creative work so that it's not lost. And so we can think about how it resonates in the present day, as it so often does. And you talk about some of these processes. Sorry, I won't talk for very much longer, because if I do that, I might as well just read the whole book, which would be a pleasure. But, other people can do that for themselves as well. I was really interested in kind of spaces that women carved out. So, for example, you talk about the Feminist Film Festival, which, as you say, we can think about following Ruby Rich as a kind of research project or lab. It's not just this little limited space. It's a way of working out new ways of doing things. And you look at the passionate volunteer labour that went into producing these alternatives to the sort of market-driven, spectacular competitiveness of the mainstream festival. But you also look at how difficult it was to do that work in terms of lack of resource and the difficulty in reaching wider audiences who are not necessarily engaged in feminist activism. So this made me think about what an intellectually rich space this was. So often sort of second wave, or actually second wave was not really used in Italian feminism, but 20th century feminism is produced as this kind of bad object, in relation to contemporary feminism, which is seen as more nuanced often. It's a really intellectually rich and important space. that opened a whole debate about the possibility for women's cinema to be an independent project. There's a kind of applied utopianism rather to these spaces, to use a more contemporary term, that I really appreciated. And I really appreciated your returning to those spaces that are so often spoken about and spoken over, but we don't always get to encounter in this rich detail. So I was thinking about failure as well, because as you say, some of the aims of those movements didn't actually materialize for reasons of resource. But we have to think as well, I think, about the terms on which something is seen as a failure. I have researchers working on this at the moment around sort of activist burnout, or sort of what happens after the affect and intensity of those movements. The kind of exhaustion that sets in, and really vivid anecdotes about women sort of carrying film equipment down subway steps and how exhausting that is and how difficult it is to maintain in a world that makes that kind of work unsustainable and produces that work as unsustainable as a sort of alibi for the radical unsustainability of the systems that it reproduces. There's a whole thing there around exhaustion and burnout, but also the importance of rediscovering these histories of resistance, I think. So I've probably spoken for longer than I meant to, and I'm kind of halfway down my notes, so I will draw to a close. But yeah, I want to end by saying I really appreciated the work you did in the final section, which is about production. And this is where I feel a real sense of hope, because I think these questions about not just how can we have better representations, but how can we change or find alternatives to the sort of patriarchal relations of production and consumption that underpin mainstream cinema. This is really important work which you approach with great care. And I finally wanted to say, I'm aware that you're carrying on this work in new cultural spaces and in new projects. And I would love to hear about those as well. But thank you. I will stop talking now and hand back the microphone.
Thanks very much to Debra and Danielle for those responses. A couple of questions were raised in there. Do you want to respond?
I hope I took my notes well, because thank you for these wonderful responses. I also kind of flattered, and so I'm still processing. There's a lot to unpack in both your comments. So I will try to go in order, and I hope I won't leave anything outside. In relation to this idea of this separation that usually there's been and is in film studies in general, to kind of struggle to link the level of mainstream film production, but also the engagement of everyday, let's say, common spectators, and then this level of feminist, experimental, activist filmmaking that seemed to be this like impossible divide. I tried to look again to try to figure this out by kind of just starting from a very basic intuition that is, of course, feminist activists were also spectators of films, and mainstream ones. And they talked about those because they were very much concerned about what these films said about women, with this concern about, again, that was there, even if not very theoretically refined, as we probably have seen in other geographical contexts, like especially we see a lot of like feminist film theory emerging in the 70s. And in Italy, the debate on films was very much less theoretically informed, but very much more responsive in terms of effectively engage with what mass cultures say about women and how this mass culture affects us as women in our lives. So it was actually what women were writing and feminists were writing about films in that period that kind of gave me the answer. So that's also, I'm talking about this idea of, again, empirical theorizing in terms that it's the answers were all there in what people were writing and saying themselves. Women were writing, and feminists themselves were very much concerned and talking about mainstream cinema and mass culture, that what we can assume. So this separation wasn't there, it was so organic. And even the few films that have been made in that period by feminist filmmakers, of course, they don't seem to actually engage with the mainstream cinema at the time, because they didn't have the resources, mostly because were films made with the contingency of what activism asked them in that particular moment, but also the fact that they literally couldn't get access to funding. So we go back to the questions of like patriarchal relations in the film industry and how they actually impact then also the possibility to evolve this very grassroots filmmaking that started at that point. And then again, there's been a very difficult, again, and it's something that also you, Danielle, discuss a lot in your work, the relationship between Italian cinema and gender more broadly, and feminism as well, as like a completely detachment and impossibility of integration if we look at again at just a representation. But then if we look again at the practices that were surrounding it and discussions and debates, then we see that things were more complex. And then yeah, of course, there's this question of the histories of failure and how we can talk about this. And this is, of course, reconstructing histories that often practitioners maybe made 1-2 films that their name disappeared, or we don't know anything about it, never made films anymore, or just like participated in some film workshops and then we don't know anything about them again. It's difficult to talk about this in terms of failure in just like framework of achievement of wanting just like to look at the product that is the finished film or the full-length film. Probably I just talk about a couple of them in the entire book, or not, maybe 5 or 6 full-length commercially distributed films in the entire book. And that's perfectly fine. It doesn't actually necessarily reflect a failure in this women trajectories. It's just trying to see why this happened. And we see that how hampered was their access to the industry, how actually there were systemic issues that couldn't be faced individually, as also the organization of the labor in the film industry makes even more difficult for women to kind of overcome this isolation and, of course, achieve in canonical terms. So what does it mean achieving? Okay, so this is like, and this is also very much related to the idea of like feminist failure, in terms of the feminists of that generation failed because look where we are, and also what the patriarchal, the pervasiveness of patriarchy in Italy, you really feel it in your skin. Again, growing up there, I can testify for that. But as from my generational perspective, doing this work was also a way to heal in relation to that possible political failure of those of that generation, and understand that what they were doing is not that much different to what we are trying to do, or what contemporary feminist movements are doing at the moment, and what the actual context and the contingencies of everyday life again might pose in between you and achieving something as a movement. So that kind of reconciled me a little bit, and also made me, and even now, for instance, making a very much point about contemporary times in which, for instance, the rights for abortion, access to abortion in Italy are massively under attack. And this was one of the massive achievements of this generation, to make safe abortions accessible to women. And that's now really under attack, and these two generations, mine and younger people, and the generation from the 70s, are joining again forces and trying to understand what went wrong and why we are here again, to kind of, do struggles to keep this the control of our bodies. But I don't want to see this as a linear trajectory, as a failure again. Or, okay, this rise has been achieved and then now it's done. But actually there's a continuum, and also there are circularities. And this is of course, in terms of feminist generations, obviously, but also in cinema history, you can see that again, because in the period in which I was still living in Italy, and I was starting to write the project of this book, actually, I was seeing that, again, film screenings were made to talk about abortion, to talk about women's rights at work, and film or media really played a part again and tried to foster also generational dialogue, but again, campaigns, etc. And was also something that inspired me also to see the productivity of anachronism and my posterity in writing this historiography. And this brings me to the fact that this was a project that I did in the shadow, because I was, and I still am, early career scholar. I was just after my PhD, and I was working precariously on another project. There was my PI project, and then but it wasn't what I wanted to work on. And then this was what it came also from that frustration on not having that freedom to expand my ideas, not just in terms of times, because it wasn't paying my paycheck, this researching our feminist archives, but also because the work that I was expected to do in that position was expected to nurture that mainstream historiography of canons, of authors, of celebratory ways of, singled out important men in film institutions or as directors. And that's what I was expecting to nurture also with my research. So it was a shadow project, but it was also very prompt by anger. And now, and this is also very much about feminism as well. And so that's why I wanted also to channel this kind of affect in terms of what this project meant to me as a woman academic in Italy in that particular moment, but also in Italian academia in that time, and what I was expected to do as an early career scholar on a precarious contract. So there's lots of things, and it was also good for me to find a positionality in this history position, and place myself and be more confident about what you can bring and your experience as researcher and as an activist and as a woman to your way of approaching sources, but also writing. So I always also trying to in this shadow project to channel all these emotions and what they actually told me about the stuff that I was reading and all the stories that I was putting together, and how the fact that I was relating to some of the stories of these women that get maybe stolen ideas, or I don't know, told to stay in their place or not say what they think, and like how much I wanted to kind of talk about that and how that was important. And because we don't talk about that a lot, because we think it's not important, or don't tell us anything about cinema or films, whereas I think that tells a lot about how films are made and how we experience them, and how we can actually do probably also better. So yeah, I hope I covered most of it. I think there was a question about girls and women, and I have to say that I try to stay very much in the sources. So at the time, historically, the girl was the unmarried woman. So this idea that brings you to maturity. So there was a lot of this projection in marriage, also in young age. And so then you kind of became a woman. So that's kind of, and obviously that made me reflect quite a lot historically how this has changed, exactly as you said, with feminism, when then all these discourses about also marriage and divorce kind of also changed the way in which womanhood is achieved in that particular context. So, and that also is very much present in what feminists were saying about films as well, and how marriage was romanticized or seen as this landmark moment in which, again, you reach womanhood through this right. So, yeah, I hope I.
Great, thank you. As chair of the session, I think I'll push in and ask my own question. I think anger is good. I think it's necessary, and I think it's been also very productive, certainly for feminism generally. But I think one of the aspects of your book, which is also really interesting, is the sort of celebratory aspect. It's not necessarily just about being angry. It's also about discovering all of the great things that women did, even though they were excluded and silenced. All of those attempts to silence women's activities relating to cinema were certainly there, but nevertheless, women found ways to participate in film culture, to participate in the making of films, and so on and so forth. So I find that to be a really refreshing and great perspective to bring to these kinds of debates, a sort of celebration, rather than being sort of angry and critical all the time. Actually say there were some great things going on. Yeah.
Yeah, that's another point, like, but also because that happens when you really shift the focus, and in which you say women are everywhere, sources are telling this. So it's not just like a celebration, but it's really like shifting the perspective and point of view, and that becomes really the center. And so really you can build an historiography in which women are everywhere, and I didn't want this to appear like they were everywhere despite of. I want despite. So they, no, this is great in itself, as you say, and it just stands there. And then all this despite is obviously important to understand these experiences. So all the obstacles, the structural issues that were there, because it's always important to flag them. But at the same time, I didn't want to just talk about this as unrelated with actually the fact that things were happening and were actually very important as they were, despite we always considered certain marginal practices or certain marginal ways of filmmaking, for instance, not that much relevant for the grand scheme of cinema history. But then in an historiography like this, Super 8 and 16 millimeter are way much more important than 35 millimeter full-length films. And so that's it. That doesn't mean that we don't have to just like talk for what they were. So it's really like shifting the center and see, let's put these practices that are usually considered marginal as the center, and the framework also through which we look at these other mainstream and canonically conceived central practices. So it's really like putting the margin at the center, and I'm not the first person to say that at all. but really like reconsider what we think with margins and marginality, and why we call them that as such.
Great, thank you. Danielle, Debra, do you have any further comments, reflections, responses to what Dalila's just said? Okay, if anyone in the audience has any particular questions to ask about what they've heard. Carlos, yes? Generally speaking, for those listening online, the question has been asked about feminist film festivals, and I'll let Dalila elaborate on that.
Yeah, so basically these film festivals, first of all, there are very few sources available. So basically historiography might just rely on catalogs, brochures, maybe a couple of critical reviews of the festival, and then obviously you have to go and ask people. So as the people that were there and organized them, and so that where probably the study opened doors, but there are also a lot of people that opened doors to me to give them their informations and share with me their memories, which was absolutely crucial, because again, one other thing to as historian again is that feminist Italian archives kept very little about the things that were related to arts, or so even the festivals, again, films, because the big chunk of the materials were like political stuff. So magazines, discussions about activists, and meetings discussing again the next demonstration. So that was the importance. So and so there are this is the periphery, and so even when you talk to the activists of the time, they have they tend to say, oh, I don't have that much memories about it, because they remember maybe more stuff that was considered more politically relevant, even though working with the arts, with film, and was still considered very important. If you then look at the sources available, you see that the effort, you see what was put in there also in affective terms, and how they engaged really even with this more frivolous, let's say, political forms of express their politics. But in terms of these feminist festivals, they really reflected what was the situation in the movement at the time. So a lot of utopianism, this idea of also experimentation, so use film to discuss topics, or for instance was a laboratory, for instance, also of to rewrite cinema history. So we see in this period some festivals programming films from film pioneers from the silent period, or things that now we study finally, but that at the time we're starting to put together these filmographies and these programs and discuss them together critically. They made workshops about analyzing the feminist women's representation in mainstream films, and they discussed collectively films and this idea of collective reading. So discussing together and come together with a reading of the film, starting from our experiences of women and how we relate with film's characters, and was a collective process. So, but it's more like about doing and not that much about writing and theorizing and that getting into any form of institution, kind of academia. So that's what reflects very much the nature of the movement at the time, that struggled with institutionalization in terms of institutions of every sort. So getting public funding or ask for money, a relationship with universities were problematic or very thin. There wasn't that dialogue, and then that in the 80s, when the impetus of the movement kind of started to fade as it was in the 70s, the fact that these connections, collaborations with institutions hadn't been very much developed, kind of stopped those experiences of kind of change them radically. And that also comes with the burden of activism again. So putting all your personal resources, work for free, and what this also mean in terms of who can participate and who not, and who doesn't. And then this obviously led to the other issues. So how can we engage with a broader spectatorship, and or the woman who's not politicized? That was another issue. So which again, these are not questions that have disappeared from political movements at all. So in that respect, it was also interesting to again look at with anachronistic eyes. So thank you for the question.
Another question. Thanks, Denise.
That it's really, reading anything other than your own research is a hard job. So it really prompts that. So I will read, obviously, but I have a particular question about the number 11 on the content, a materialist trajectory in feminist filmmaking, rethinking labor and consciousness raising. First of all, I'm more familiar with the materialist practices in Britain and French, and mostly on the kind of experimental and the avant-garde side of practices. But I didn't know that there was such trajectory in Italian feminist filmmaking. And I wondered if it is a kind of Marxist materialism, and B, if it was at all positioned kind of against or kind of as a kind of counter practice to consciousness raising. And when we say rethinking of labor, was it at all anyway kind of practice that aimed at demystifying filmmaking labor or labor in general? What was that? So I'm just kind of keep going, but yeah, these are the questions I have on that. But you can maybe just say a few things. You don't have to summarize the whole chapter, but.
Try to summarize the question for those listening online. The question relates to feminist materialism in the context of Dalila's book.
Yes, absolutely. There was materialism from Marxist perspective in terms of also a little bit a revision of it. because there was in feminist filmmaking at the time, there was a very much dialogue, but also clash with what was the Marxist Marxist activism and the broader left-wing movement. So there was a feminist critique of that, but it was also a contamination. And so this how translated in film practice. This translated that feminist filmmakers took this idea of deconstructing the practices of filmmaker in terms of hierarchy, for instance, or the idea of challenging this idea of making films for profit, and what also film as mass culture means, and what actually doing political films meant, also in terms of how labor was organized. So you see film collectives emerging, and they did very few films, but there's a lot of discussion of their practices and how these practices could be feminist, but also challenge capitalist and hierarchical structures, or the idea of producing entertainment. So there was a lot of this kind of things that were obviously related to Marxism, but there was also this idea of using the filmmaking process as a process of consciousness rising as women. So doing films between women, in groups of women, and what that meant, the process in itself. So you have maybe or not film, or a film that doesn't seem to reflect at all these different practices, but then you see what the writings are about, and they did, I don't know, endless meetings in which they were sharing their experiences, emotions, and what that meant on their filmmaking practice as women, but also a lot of discussions of how, as women, the access to technologies. So the fact that doing certain type of productions will require to have access to certain technical skills that there weren't women that had those, because of the lack of access to film schools or lack of training and so on and so forth. And so this kind of barrier with technology, so discussions about that and what that meant in terms of being a woman filmmaker. So there was a lot of going on in that respect, and it would be interesting to see how it relates with contemporary other contemporary national contexts, because they went to festivals as well. I know filmmakers that went to the Edinburgh Film Festival, which was programming Laura Mulvey and films. So there was exchange, and that would be kind of desire to understand how these networks actually played out. So that's work that still needs to be done, and how this idea circulated, and all the specificity, because obviously there was a very specific declination of both Marxism in that period and feminism, in terms of there was the autonomia in Italy that had its own interpretation of the idea of labor and culture and how they played out. And then also feminism with consciousness rising, it's slightly different of how it was conceptualized in other, I think about especially the American contexts. In Italy, it was very much more imbricated with psychology, but also other sort of politicizing the private in kind of different ways. So understanding this specificities, how they translated with the broader transnational connections that they had.
Question from Mariam.
Makes me want to go back and look at some of the
highlighted sections. I just wanted to kind of remind you, Debra asked you about how this project that started as a shadow project and turned into a wonderful book, where is it leading to your future work?
The question relates to where is this work going to go in the future?
I think it's there's very much a connection with what I said in responding to Denise. I was really stimulated by this idea of these transnational connections and kind of really challenging this like container of Italian cinema and kind of looking at how ideas, people, and films are circulated and see how these networks worked. So my attention is shifting more there. So there's a lot of this book that still informs my current project, but I'm more concentrating on this idea of the transnational connections and across activist filmmakers, particularly focusing on the 80s at the moment and not with a specific attention to Italy, even though, of course, as soon as I could when I was in Italy a few weeks ago, I went to Italian archive just to double check if there was something there of interest, and there was, obviously. But I'm more interested in exploring this activist infrastructures and what they actually, how they played out and what were the outcomes also in terms of debates and filmmaking practices. But yeah, so this is what I'm going at.
Sounds great. We have another question.
The undergraduate was referenced to engaging sort of fourth wave feminism and the most recent forms and what they can kind of gain from learning about this specifically.
Questions more or less about the historical moment and what we can learn from the feminism that was practiced during this period, what we can learn today.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question because at a certain point when I was precisely exploring this idea of consciousness rising, for instance, how it was practiced in relation to film, and how actually, for instance, now a lot of social media activism stems from this idea of like sharing experiences, right? And using media to mediate and communicate your experience. And that was what was happening at the time. And so, and this can be read, I think that the fact that there's this, there are a lot of ruptures and discontinuity, and of course there are massive differences because of media specificity, and we can go on and on and on and saying that obviously this is a very flawed comparison. But I think that's what I believe students, but not just students, who are not necessarily interested in Italian cinema or in cinema history, can get from this book. So kind of related to these practices and how we engage effectively or politically with these practices, which again, we're very much in the everyday, and we still have everyday engagement, of course, with media. So I think that, and this is also I kept in mind when I was writing the book, as also thinking about how I relate with these stories, is also to kind of see how these stories really can speak because of their everydayness, despite the specificity in history and obviously the medium that I was considering. So, of course, it also because of the level of detail. So it's can help to a student who's very interested in Italian culture or in film history. But I guess again, there's space because of this framework that I try to build centered on everydayness and affect. So that's what I hope that the book can do to a reader, a younger reader, or someone who's not very much interested in this specific subject. So hope makes sense.
Great. Do we have any more questions from the floor? Got a question up the back there.
Agenda, whether it's Collins or French or anywhere. It don't cost anything.
Question relating to the earliest years of the study, the 1950s and 60s. Yeah, did Dalila come across any positive examples of sort of mass distributed popular films that were, I don't know, successfully feminist, I guess? Yeah.
It's an interesting question because I try to I don't know if you mean in terms of historical reception of then maybe this film have been recuperated later on by feminists, or if you think that there's, because otherwise I think it's complicated to say that there's positive or negative, especially in relation to that period in which there was a form of feminism, there was emancipation and more engaged in emancipation and equality rather than difference and stressing on the difference of women. So there was a sort of like feminism that was linked to more Marxism and socialism at the time, and historically they were supporting or kind of like seeing positively strong female characters, for instance, in some films, or trying, and it was interesting, so especially in some of the women's magazines of the late 50s and 60s, that they did this personality quiz in which they basically asked, are you a careful spectator? This was a left-wing women's magazine. And they asked in the various questions on how they related with famous characters in films, and if these characters were positive or negative according to the Italian communist ethos of what femininity was at the time. And so this idea of like do already a sort of like reading against the grain, the mainstream popular culture, and see what like positive roles for women are in mainstream film. But in terms of what I believe, it's difficult because I try always not to do an evaluative, anachronistic judgment of what films say, but rather I try to complicate and unpack even those apparently seemingly very exploitative and objectifying representations or films, also in the 70s, but even in the 50s and the 60s, and trying to see how we can unpack those negative, seemingly negative, in order to see what's around them and how actually people relate to them, instead of saying positive or negative necessarily. But it's a good question. It's difficult to respond. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think we're getting to a certain point where I'm going to ask Danielle and Debra if they've got any further questions or comments to add.
Simply to say thanks again, Dalila, for kind of opening out. I was thinking a little bit about some of the things that have come up in relation to female spectatorship, and it struck me that some of those questions you mentioned about the sort of memory and recuperation and crossing between mainstream and feminist perspectives came up in our project, that the project that I was involved in on audience memories of the 1950s that you might remember. So it might be worth looking at a few of those interviews at some point, because the older we interviewed over 80 women over the age of 65 about their memories of going to the cinema in Italy in the 50s and 60s. And it was interesting that quite a few of them spoke about a kind of viewing mode they had when they were young and a viewing mode they had now, and the ways that feminism had in some ways influenced that. So in terms of thinking about those trajectories, and I think this idea of the diffusion of feminism that comes up sometimes in your book is just another further perspective, I think, on those kind of ideas you were discussing about the complexity, even over the course of a lifetime, that might start from one perspective and end somewhere very different. Yeah, but thank you again.
No, I don't have anything to add. I'm also working on questions around recuperation and nostalgia and history and memory. So I would love to hear more about that project, but maybe we'll talk about that later. I don't have anything to add except, again, thank you, Dalila. It's been a real pleasure to read and live alongside the book for the last few weeks. And this all happened because of sheer serendipity, by the way. We just ran into each other in a coffee shop and were introduced. So it's great when those encounters and connections happen. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you and congratulations. I think we should give Dalila a rest and probably a drink soon, but I'll back to you.
So I will ask if there are any further questions. In that case, then I think we'll wrap things up, and let's thank Danielle, Debra, and Dalila for a really stimulating set of conversations, and thank you too for the people here for asking such interesting questions as well. I guess I should have asked if there are any questions online, but we don't have any. Well, that's perfectly fine. So put your hands together. Okay, we can continue discussions over a glass of wine. But generally speaking, let's call it quits there.